So can I move around a little bit? Or do I need to be here for the?
You can actually take the microphone and wander
And just,
on.
okay, just stay in general that range now.
Yes.
Okay.
Good evening. My name is Benedict Lecca, Executive Director of the Redwood Library. I want to welcome you to a very special evening with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who has had some airport issues, signing bills, and then he made it here miraculously. So we're grateful. And of course, we consider him one of the most important voices in Washington. And when I think about the congressional delegation from Rhode Island, I mean, it's really remarkable. We have such a strong team. I want to welcome him and thank him for coming, and he will be discussing his book. And of course, after, he will also kindly sign books for any of you who are interested in buying the book. And then when all that is done, if you're interested, I'd be glad to give people a tour of the exhibition, since we're celebrating, of course, our 275th. And we've got some very good stuff in there. So if people are interested to do that, we can do that as well. So without further ado, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, thank you.
Thank you, Benedict. So first, a word on procedure. I will probably talk for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And then if you have questions or comments, we can turn this into a little bit more of a conversation. That usually is more fun. But if you think I'm going to talk for 40 minutes, you're going to be disappointed. So be thinking of your questions or comments. And I am lucky to be here. It's the first time I've actually called security and said, you got to rush me to the airport to get to the plane, otherwise I'm not going to make it. Literally, it's straight here from the airport. So it's a close shave, but it worked, thank goodness. So very, very, very happy to be here with you this evening for that reason. So this book is part textbook. Don't be frightened, it's not that boring, I don't think. Part detective story. Part cross memo. What people who are in that business know. You put a prosecution memo together before you charge a case to make sure you've checked and double checked your work, to make sure the supervisors see that you've done your homework and all of that. So prosecution memo is cross memo, making it as you know. And part warning flare, that things have gone seriously, seriously wrong at the Supreme Court, and we need to give it really urgent attention. This was written before the Dobbs decision. So the Supreme Court has been proving on my case against it with the Dobbs decision, and the recent events with the $30 million whining and dining, and we'll let you know what happened in Hobby Lobby early situation only makes it worse. So the book has become a little bit more topical than it was when I started writing it, but I really wanted to put this down on paper because people weren't paying attention to what was going on at the Supreme Court. And it came on us pretty slowly in many respects. This started years and years ago. And I guess the overarching point that I'd like to have you have in your mind as we talk about this involves two concepts. And the first concept is called regulatory capture. And if you read like administrative law treatises or economics treatises, there's abundant literature on regulatory capture. In a nutshell, it's when the robber barons ran the railroad commissions that set the rates for the robber barons' railroads. So the regulatory agency was not serving the public, it was captured by the special interests that would benefit from it. And that's not necessarily old news. You saw quite recently with the blow up in the Gulf and the disaster was now BOEM, but was then called Minerals Management Service, and how they were frolicking with the people they were supposed to regulate rather than regulating them. So that's been a persistent theme. And that's the theme to keep in mind. This is not a conservative court. This is a captured court, and those two things are quite different. The second thing to keep in mind, and I say this as the son of a former CIA officer. When I was very, very young, he switched to the Foreign Service, at some point anyway. But is covert operations. It's not at all uncommon for countries to run covert operations in other countries that are designed to destabilize the regime, that are designed to create a certain measure of havoc, and they use tradecraft when they're doing that. And if you look at the tradecraft that is used by governments running intelligence operations covertly in other countries, you see an awful lot of that tradecraft here. Two things were new here. The first is that somebody decided regulatory capture didn't need to be just regulatory agencies. You could do it just as easily to a court. Now, it takes a certain amount of hubris and a certain amount of being a little bit, like, unpleasantly sick to say, let's do that to the United States Supreme Court. But once you've decided to do that, it's actually not that different a proposition. And the second thing is that ordinarily covert operations are run against foreign enemies. This was a covert operation run in and against our own country by our own countrymen, and specifically, folks associated with the fossil fuel industry, which was the prime protagonist in all of this mess. So it started many years ago when the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is now the biggest lobbying shop in the country. It is 3 times the lobbying clout of the next biggest lobby shop in Washington. It is dominant. And it litigates, and it goes into regulatory proceedings, and it goes into campaigns, and it spends dark money on top of its huge lobbying effort. So it is a big brute. And back in the day, it decided that the 60s were getting a little bit frightening for corporate America. And there were all these women who wanted to get involved in companies, and there were all these pollution problems that they were looking at companies to solve. And there was all this civil rights stuff that was creating upheaval. And there were these youth movements that were highly disrespectful. And something needed to be done, harumph. And so they hired a lawyer, a tobacco lawyer from Virginia, a very smart and able guy, to write them a report on what should we do about this. And that report still exists today, and you can go and read it. And it was written by the lawyer who was named Lewis Powell. And if you know Supreme Court history, you know that he became Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell. And the gap between when he turned over the report and when he became Supreme Court Justice was just a few months. And he did not disclose the report to the Senate in his confirmation, in case you were wondering about that. And the interesting thing about the report that was particular to this is that there was a section saying there's an overlooked opportunity in the courts. If we look at the courts, activist courts can change the culture and the economy of the country. And that, I think, was probably the document that planted the thought that was the seed that then grew into all of this. What it grew into was very big. People who've looked at it and done the math and dug into the different groups, count the groups by the dozen. But when you think of these groups, don't think of them as individual groups. Think of a piano and the piano keys. And each key can be played, but there's a piano player behind all the keys. It's really that orchestrated and organized. And the spend that we've been able to show on it so far has been $580 million. So you don't spend $500 million without having some pretty solid ROI that you want back from your investment. So it's a big operation. It's a well-obscured operation, at least as to who's behind the piano keys. And it's been a very successful operation. I used to do appellate work, so I was kind of versed in this stuff. So it struck me sooner than a lot of other people, some of the things that were going wrong at the court, some things were just being done completely wrong. The court was doing fact-finding. Well, appellate courts aren't supposed to do fact-finding. In fact, it's really important from a separation of powers point of view that they not do fact-finding. It's one of the tethers that keeps them from running around and making policy, which they're not supposed to do as part of their judicial function. So when they started doing a lot of fact-finding, that seemed weird. And then they started finding false facts, which seemed even weirder. And what really ripped it for me was after the Citizens United decision, which I thought was a complete disgrace. I think it's going to go down as one of the worst decisions in Supreme Court history when people look back at it. But what struck me is that in the wake of that, I responded in a subsequent case to the court saying, hey, you got this wrong. You said that all this spending was going to be transparent. And you said that if it wasn't transparent, it would be corrupting. Well, guess what? It's not transparent. We can prove it. You just have to look at the newspaper, and that means it's corrupting. So you need to take a second look, and this was the Montana Bullock case, and you need to at least let Montana come into the court and make its case as to why it should be able to control dark money in Montana state elections, which was the issue. So my co-author on that brief was my buddy John McCain. And it's one thing for the Supreme Court to blow off the junior senator from Rhode Island, the noisemaker on the Judiciary Committee. It's another thing when it's bipartisan. It's another thing when it's the guy who carried the Republican Party's banner into a presidential election and did so with real distinction. And it's another thing when he's the leading expert on campaign finance in the Senate. When they blew us off, that was what really ripped it for me. And that's when I knew I had to get digging and look into this. And I wrote an article shortly afterwards that went through these decisions that were coming out of the court 5-4, partisan. And when we started digging and we looked for the ones that were 5-4, that were civil cases, because that's where the money and the important stuff is, and that had a clearly identifiable, no problem identifying it, Republican donor interest at stake. Well, it turned out we found 72 that fit that bill. And the score in them of who won was 72-0 in favor of the Republican donor interest. So now I was really on the warpath, and that's what led to writing this book, because I can't give this talk, 200,000 times. I've got to let a book speak for me. And so that's what the book is about. Just because of the news and the way the court's behaved, there is a lot that is pertinent about it now, and it's getting a lot more attention than it ordinarily would, which I think is, on the one hand, good for the book, and on the other hand, good for the court and the effort to correct it so they could continue. Remember the story of the emperor with no clothes? That emperor is going to walk their ass that whole parade. That kid was not saying, why does the emperor not wear any clothes? I'm the kid saying, the emperor is buck naked, guys, what's going on here? And a lot of people are noticing the same thing, and now they're very upset. I don't know if you saw my last exchange with the court, but it was really cranky and very low rent from them. So that's where we are. I hope you enjoy it. There are a lot of good stories in it. I can start telling them, but I'd rather just hear from you, and if you have any questions about what I've tried to do and what the story is and what's behind it. I should add one last thing. When I said $580 million, you might have thought, well, that's an awful lot of money. The guy who runs this operation, who's the intermediary, the orchestrator, the MC, the guy who runs the show for the big dark money interests who are behind this operation, is a guy named Leonard Leo. If you have not heard of him, you probably will in the months ahead. But he put together the front groups through which this operation has been run. We actually describe in my office the front group array as the Leo bug, because it looks like a bug. It's got a head, which is his CRC advisors group with two little prongs on it that are two subordinate groups to CRC. And then it's got the body, the thorax, whatever you call it. And that has two elements to it, because these days the way you play politics is you have a 501c3 organization butted up against a 501c4 organization in the same location, with the same directors and the same staff, and they're indistinguishable. You could pierce the corporate veil with a banana if you wanted to, but technically it's a 501c3 and a 501c4. So he has the two of them, or the two sides of the body. One is called Concord Fund, the other called 85 Fund. And then they got three little legs coming off of each of them. And one pair of legs is the 501c3, 501c4 combo that messes around with judicial campaigns. That gets a check for $15 million, a check for $17 million, and puts it on TV ads for Gorsuch, for Kavanaugh, for whomever. And so there's that pair. And then there's another one, another pair of legs, if you will, also 501c3, also 501c4, and that is a pair of groups that go out and do voter suppression, making sure that certain people don't want certain people to vote. That's how they do it. And there's a third one that hasn't been used very much, but is on the books. And that's the one that gets people all excited about how we're teaching critical race theory to school children, which of course isn't being taught in any school in the country anywhere. You rarely can find it in law schools, but it's the kind of thing that whips up the Fox News audience, and so they love to talk about it. So this thing looks like a bug, and if you look at it, that's 3, 8, 11 organizations just making up that one bug. And they're all connected to this character Leonard Leo. But the news he made recently was when a billionaire gave $1.6 billion to a front group in Utah, a 501c4, also controlled by Leonard Leo. And this guy is now sitting on $1.6 billion. And once it goes into that network, once it goes into the piano, you don't know which piano key, which tentacle it's going to squirt out of. Some of it probably got spent in this election. Some of it was probably his reward for having packed the court. Thank you, Sonny. You've done a really nice job for us. Here's $1.6 billion you're taken care of for life. And some of it is just continued operations at trying to, go on political attacks of various kinds. But that is a documented thing. $1.6 billion into a 501c4 dark money organization to be run by the same guy who was the impresario of the packing of our court. How about that? So, as Stan used to say to Holly, it's a fine mess. Yeah, Meg.
I pulled out an old copy of the anti-indictment, which is a racketeering case. And in my old days, I happened to be sitting next to an intern of mine way back then, but he's head of the criminal.
These are two very dangerous prosecutors, so
But my point is that this seems like such an amazingly clear racketeering. You have an enterprise, you have a series of criminality, you have money, you have all the big. So I wish I were younger, I would try the case to win it.
Yeah.
So why is it no one even mentioning this? Not you, but I'm saying you don't read about it, don't hear about it. It seems like they're afraid to touch this. It's like an explosive thing.
Because the immediate target of the scheme is to control the Supreme Court, you have to get through the constitutional protection for people to petition their government. It's a little bit the same way the fossil fuel industry violates every antitrust law, schemes secretly, coordinates together, and comes in through their lobbyists to push Congress around and tell us what to do, and then give a lot of money to people who do it, and then hammer people with dirty ads who don't do it. And that's all protected because the target is a government agency. If the same thing had been organized for the purpose of, say, attacking GM or taking over some private entity for a corrupted financial motive, I think you're absolutely right. The technique of what they did here, a little bit like I said, the technique was covert operations. It also is very much resembles the technique of a racketeering operation, but it's protected from that because the target is the government. Yeah.
Have you ever thought of political
political martyr as Supreme Court cases.
I can explain that if you want. Let's say the Federal Society is going about their business.
Yeah.
Sort of reverse engineering these cases or these suits to
Yeah.
better suit their agenda.
Yeah.
And they're shopping around for these plaintiffs.
Yeah.
And in time, that's where you come in. Let's say they're going after LGBTQ rights or something like that, and that's where you would come in and create this sort of political martyr, being a Democrat plaintiff in your own case against
To set up a case the way they do.
exactly
Yeah.
their case, but
Yeah.
your,
So one of the weird things about the way they behave, and I described this in the book, is that because they've captured the court, one of the signals that they've captured the court, a piece of the network of circumstantial evidence that shows not only have they captured the court, but they know they've captured the court, is that they have developed these high-speed lanes for the front groups to bring cases to the Supreme Court. I have done a lot of litigating in my life. I have never once gone into court and said, Your Honor, I'm here to lose. And quickly, please.
I think that you're sort of creating these precedents in case they come at the court with
Yeah.
the same.
The problem is that you end up,
He's gonna be ushered to the Supreme Court and they're just gonna hit it with an amicus, and it's gonna be a law anyway, so why not just?
so I'm trying to do that in these two ways. The first is, when they set up those speed lanes, I write an amicus brief to the court, and I lay out what has happened and how this rush job violates all sorts of principles of judicial decorum and appellate procedure. But they go rocketing up, then they go to the Circuit Court of Appeals, and there they say, please, sir, we'd like to lose as quickly as we can too, because they're in a huge rush to get up to the Supreme Court. They had a huge labor case, and they were in a huge rush to get the Supreme Court on, and they weren't fast enough. Scalia had died. They lost the case. It was 4-4. It had to go back to the Ninth Circuit. So as soon as they had Gorsuch in, kaboom, they brought an identical case. They flipped people around so that the group that had been the litigating group in the first case was an amicus in the second case, and a group that had been an amicus in the first case was the litigating group in the second case. And they went out and found a plaintiff who turned out to join the employment of the organization that was there. It was usually lawyers, the plaintiff comes into your office. You don't go out looking for a plaintiff. So these cases where you look to lose, where you look for your plaintiff, and where you just try to get to the court as quickly as you can are all real telltales if you recognize the scratching in the weeds. And then I go to the court and I explain the group around them. I've actually done an appendix in the back of one of my amicus briefs that says, okay, here are like 10 of our friendly amici right here in this case, and here's who's funding them. And so just like a graph, check, 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 check. Donors trust everybody. Bradley Fund, 10 out of 12. You can go right down the list. And the latest one, I got really mad because some of the people in this Moore v. Harper decision, the one that, if it's adopted, as some of these people want, would allow state legislatures to overturn all elections without any review by the state court or by the federal courts. So any place where the Republicans control the legislature, that means they would control the outcome of elections. So not a great thing. It was the theory of the Trump effort to undo the election. And many of his little stooges went into various courts and pitched that notion. And they all got thrown out on their rears. But they turned up in this case as amici, as if they were legit. People who have been, had their phones seized by the FBI. People who have appeared in grand juries to give testimony, showing up as if all of this was absolutely legit. So I did an immediate run of the some of the stickier amici in that case. It was not a usual amicus brief, but these aren't usual times. Yes?
So what's the advantage of the C4 structure in the nonprofits?
So a C3 and a C4, the C3 allows you to deduct donations to it. The C4 has a very phony baloney rule that says you cannot do political work through a 501c4, which over the years, the IRS read to me, it couldn't be the primary purpose, which over the years, people cavilled to me, so we can go to 49%, which basically means if you wanted to play in politics and you wanted to hide who you were, you paid a 51% tax on your 49% spend. But if you were playing for big money, what the hell? To buy anonymity for 51%, super deal. They took it all the time. And now they figured out that, okay, let's say you got Leonard Leo's Leo bug and you got those 8 organizations. So 501c4 spends, say you get $1 billion donation. First 501c4 puts $500 million into politics, gives the other half to the next 501c4. The next 501c4 puts $250 million into politics and gives the remaining 250 to the next 501c4. And they cut it in half and they cut it in half. And if you've got 4 or 5 of these piano keys on your piano together, you can punch that 49% number up to 92% real quick. And that is what is going on in the system. And it's just SOP, and the court has turned a spectacularly blind eye to it. The worst decision the court has rendered recently, other than Dobbs, and probably in terms of long-range effect on democracy, is worse than Dobbs, was a case called the Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus Bonta. Americans for Prosperity Foundation is a 501c3.
Yes.
And it was the plaintiff in that case, and it wanted to argue that it didn't have to say who the donors were to anybody. California couldn't find out, even to prevent fraud for people self-dealing through the 501c3. The 501c4, with which it shares officers, staff, location, donors, again, here's that corporate veil of the banana, is called Americans for Prosperity. And if you've been following politics, you will know that Americans for Prosperity is the primary political battleship of the Koch brothers' political network. So the idea that these people who were basically picked by the Koch brothers did not know that Americans for Prosperity Foundation was related to Americans for Prosperity, like there are a few clues, and gave them this freedom to hide their donors when you really can't distinguish between the political side and the non-political side. That creates the avenue to bake a permanent constitutional right to dark money into the Constitution. And that's what they're up to in that case. And it is really, really, really dangerous. Yeah.
When did the money stop?
Hmm?
America gets more rich, when will money stop? You're buying politics.
That's the problem. I mean, the numbers keep going up. We're over billions of dollars in hidden election money now. This single gift of $1.6 billion to this machine, I kind of got people's attention for 2 minutes, and everybody went back to their usual work, and we haven't really pursued that at all effectively. But let me put a money marker out there for you. The International Monetary Fund is a pretty legit group of economic analysts. And they have done work to look at how big the fossil fuel subsidies are in different countries and around the world. And they report that the fossil fuel subsidy that the fossil fuel industry enjoys just in the United States of America is $660 billion a year. So if Congress is coming at the fossil fuel industry and wants to make it even Steven for the fossil fuel industry, it has to pay for its pollution and its harms the way everybody else has to. What the fossil fuel industry is doing is defending every year a $660 billion subsidy. How much do you spend to defend that? If you spend $6.6 billion a year in politics, you're earning not 100%, what would it be? 10,000% return on investment. It's 100x your spend every year. So there is no upper limit to this because there is no upper limit to the stakes that come before the Supreme Court. And that's the problem, because we have our billionaires and they throw money at us, but that's not a profit-making effort for them. That's a burn for them, whereas for the other side, it is an investment, and it's a richly rewarding investment, and that means it will never stop unless and until we stop it.
How's that gonna happen?
How's that gonna happen is that we passed my Disclose Act,
Oh,
which requires the disclosure of any political contribution over $10,000. I don't know how many of you get more than $10,000 in races, but I think most people won't be bothered by it. If you're given more than 10 grand, you're gonna have to pony up who you are, because it's important that the public know, because as citizens, our job is to be like the citizen police of our government. And if our government is allowing the big dirty players who government was set up to defend us from to hide who they are from us, then citizenship has taken a terrible, terrible, terrible blow. And that's part of the problem with where we are right now. So disclosure does it. You turn on the lamp and the cockroaches scuttle. That's my simple way of saying it.
In this
We
environment,
passed the bill here. We tried to pass it in the Senate. Every single Republican voted against it, which shows, it's not like they don't know, but it shows how much enthralled to the dark money crowd they are, because the public hates this dark money stuff. It polls through the roof. People are so mad about it. If you follow dear, wonderful, brilliant Jane Mayer, who wrote the book Dark Money, she wrote an article in the New Yorker a little while ago, and she got her hands on a transcript or a tape of Mitch McConnell's dark money minions, minioning away with the Koch brothers, dark money minions. And they were talking about an issue that they couldn't make good for them. They couldn't twist it, they couldn't twerk it, they couldn't make it right. It was kryptonite. And they were furious because their people, Tea Partiers, were just as upset as Bernie bros who went right across the spectrum. Nobody was more mad than everybody else. Everybody was furious about this one issue. What was that one issue? Dark money, hidden, massive corporate spending. And you would think, as Democrats, we have to show a lot of humility. I have to show a lot of humility as a Democrat when I talk about this, because you would think that when we got that internal leak of the other side's massive game plan, and they said, oh my God, this is fatal to us, we might act on that. Not yet. So I spent a lot of time trying to boot my party into paying more attention to this, but there is a solution, and it will work. The problem is, it's like with corruption anywhere. It gets to a certain point, and then it becomes very hard to fix it, because the corruption itself stops the fixing. And, a little corruption is fun. Everybody loves Louisiana. CNC was a character. But then, you get over that tipping point, and suddenly you're in Russia. And suddenly Putin's oligarchs are kicking your door down, coming into your boardroom with guys with guns and taking over your company, and taking you and your wife to the current gulags. Look at Navalny. So, it's a little scary how far we are down this curve of yielding to corruption. Yeah.
You mentioned it's important to know who has their fingers on the keys of the piano.
Yeah.
It's recently become more and more apparent and become more transparent that the party that has probably 12 fingers on the piano keys right now, the law firm is Jones Day. I'm sure you're aware of it. It's the largest law firm in the world. They give the Federalist Society a list of people to point to the United States Supreme Court, the circuit courts, and the appeal, and the district courts. And those are typically partners of Jones Day and major donors to the party. They take lifetime appointments to the court, and then Jones Day brings in clients. They litigate in front of those judges, and those judges typically find in favor of Jones Day's client. Jones Day is the party, everyone knows the Federalist Society provided Donald Trump with a list of candidates, but that list came from Jones Day.
I have a slightly different theory, although I agree with you that there are big law firms that are deeply enmeshed in this, and many of them are also deeply enmeshed in representing Russian oligarchs and other foreign kleptocrats that have been giving cover to those people for a long time. That's part of how the trade craft, I think, got learned. But I have a slightly different theory, and I offer to you, I can't prove it. But if you remember when Trump first ran, the Koch brothers despised him. They said they thought he was crass and classless and crude. They hated the fact that he liked social programs and said he was going to defend Medicare and Social Security at all costs. They hated that he was going to do tariffs and was against free trade. And they just thought everything about him was absolutely loathsome. And at the same time, he was no big fan of theirs. And he made a lot of fun of all of his fellow candidates when they went out to the ring kissing ceremony that the Kochs hold every year for the candidates to come and kiss their ring or whatever. And so there was a really, really bitter divide between House of Trump and House of Koch. And if you think of them as medieval principalities that were at war with each other and suddenly there was peace, you look at what might have brought peace to the warring principalities. And around the time that peace settled on the two warring principalities was the time that Leonard Leo went in with his list and said, if you say that you will appoint Supreme Court judges off this list, it'll do you a lot of good. So I think a deal was struck. And I think the Koch brothers and their operation, Leonard Leo and all of that, they got the Supreme Court and they got every energy and environmental appointee in the Trump administration, including that little scurrilous rat, Scott Pruitt, at the EPA. I mean, they had no bottom to how low they would go. And that brought peace. And the Koch brothers stopped complaining about Trump. They went back to funding Republicans and being involved in politics. And they were kept a little bit of distance because they think he's gross, but they did not. The attacks stopped, and the peace between House of Koch and House of Trump prevailed. So that's my thesis. Yeah.
Some guardrails could be put up around a corrupt Supreme Court through legislation.
Yeah, and we're looking at doing that.
And I'm just curious whether you could give, your sense, you've been in the Senate for a long time. How many senators really consciously connect these dots and are really consciously willing to embrace what is going on and at least think about working on legislation?
Until recently, there are about 4 of us.
That's it.
And now with all this exposure, it has popped up. By the way, Dan Prentice is one of the great lawyers ever. And he and I shared a terrific experience of being held in contempt of court together. Even though we were opposing each other. And Judge Boyle of Newport, he got himself so ripped up, he said, "You're both in contempt of court." And started storming off the bench. Then he came back and he said, "You know what? Never mind. Offsetting penalties." Stormed back off the bench. And again, we were both rather determined in our positions. But yeah, they have a real process problem at the court. And if you look at where they are right now, I mean, just to be really pretty brief about it, when people come in to lobby the court as amici curiae, they don't have to disclose who's behind them. When people come in to lobby me, they got to disclose who's behind them. There are these elaborate lobbying reports that have to be filed. The court should at least be there with the amici. It should actually be a good deal further, but it's not. If I get a gift, I have to report it. I have to return it in many cases. And the hospitality counts too. But one of the things I've discovered researching this book is that Justice Scalia took 80, at least, hunting trips. We know of 2, right? We know the one he died on, and we know the one he took in VP Cheney's Air Force 2. Those were the 2. 78 more at least, because of the work of a very diligent lawyer who dug all this out, traipsing around the country and digging out local news stories. They weren't reported. Why were they not reported? They weren't reported because he put them under what they call the personal hospitality exemption. What is personal hospitality? Well, for normal people, it's when you go and stay with your in-laws, or your daughter, or your brother, or your cousin, or your college roommate, or somebody with whom you have a personal relationship. Not here. Scalia's people would go out, and they would find fancy hunting resorts that he wanted to go to, and they would contact the owner of the resort and say, would you please invite Justice Scalia to your resort? Never met. Never met. But he invited him personally, and then they packed the resort with gun lobby people, fossil fuel people, so they had a really nice right-wing corporate hangout for free with Scalia. So, you know, that kind of crap just can't the court can't defend that. And unlike every other court, when you get in trouble in another court, there's a process for sorting it out. The Supreme Court has no such process. There's no complaint box where you can go and put in a complaint. If there were a complaint box, there'd be no process of inquiry afterwards. There's no independent entity to take a look. If you're a circuit court judge, they appoint other circuit judges. And if it looks like you're too close with your circuit, they'll bring people in from other circuits. And they have staff to dig into it. They ask questions. And they look into it. And at the end of the day, there's a report. No report on the Supreme Court. They just say, we're all fine. And it's been a real mess because Thomas rendered a decision that pretty directly impacted his wife,
Yeah.
because it would have held off the investigation that was looking into, among other things, her activities in the insurrection. Okay, he said, I didn't know anything about it at the time. Take that for what it's worth, right? A little hard to believe to me, but that's what he said. That is also a factual proposition that lends itself to investigation. And at a bare minimum, to send somebody in and ask him that question and put him on record so that if he lied, there is now a false statement there that can be prosecuted under 18 United States Code 1001. You know, you have at least the rudiments of some legitimacy, but none of that was done. And the simple question, what did Thomas know and when did he know it, has not yet been answered. And if you're wondering, he since voted again on a related matter, and now he can't pretend that he didn't know, because by the time of that vote, we all knew, because it was front page news, so he clearly knew. So what's his excuse now? But again, there's no inbox for that complaint. So we make a lot of noise, and finally, you know, Chairman Johnson, I've provoked the court enough that they're starting to answer us with increasingly grumpy and I think ill-advised letters. But they have no process for dealing with this, and if they don't build the guardrails, Congress will. It's as simple as that.
Does John Roberts have no control?
The question was, does John Roberts have no control? I think John Roberts actually has a lot of control. I think he very much does not want to get into this mess and use it. We know that he has at least the control to declare an investigation, because that's what he did when Alito's Dobbs draft opinion leaked.
Right.
So he can do that.
Yeah.
And if he can do that for Alito's leaked Dobbs draft opinion, he can presumably also do that for Thomas's recusal vote with his wife so implicated. But he chose not to. And, you know, I think he's gonna have to live with those choices. There is a judicial conference of judges that he presides over, and he can work rules through the judicial conference. He could put together a group to adopt a code of ethics for the Supreme Court, to present it to the court for it to adopt to itself. And he could ask the chief judges of every circuit court, there are 11 of them, to be a panel. And if somebody had an objection to something the Supreme Court was doing, send it into the advisory panel, and the advisory panel will do its homework and say, yeah, this actually was pretty legit, or nope, you should not have done that, don't do that. And it would be a public report. Because it's the Supreme Court, it can't control the Supreme Court, but you can bet the Supreme Court would control its own behavior if it knew there'd be legit reporting by other judges when they crossed the chalk line and went running off into the stands. So that's the, there are things that he could do to fix this. It is willful neglect that he is not doing it. Yeah.
Is there anything that regular citizens can do, or is it just so beyond the democratic process?
No, I think at the heart of essentially all of this is this problem of dark money. And I think if regular citizens are raising hell about dark money, that will make a big difference. And it's not only that you need to raise hell with your own voice in dark money, but we all belong to different groups. And very often the different groups that we belong to have overlooked the dark money problem. It has only recently dawned on the environmental advocacy groups that dark money is a problem for them. And they still don't really know quite what to do with it, but at least they've had the epiphany. And so to have League of Conservation Voters, NRDC, Sierra Club, and people like that get together and say, okay, this is a priority for us. And then have the civil rights groups, the NAACP and others, and then women's rights groups. And then ideally, actually, have them start talking to each other so that we have some commonality across the great cat herd of advocacy groups and make this a bigger priority. It just isn't a priority for us right now. It's new territory. The pollsters are all 65 years old and are still handing out poll questions that they decided on in the 1990s. You know, we're not doing our job on this. And if anybody here who's a member of a group, you should just check in and say, hey, you guys, you need to really raise your game on this dark money stuff. Because the civil rights community, the women's rights community, the environmental rights community, everybody loses to this court and to this dark money political operation, and they just haven't seen the commonality until now. Let's see if there are any other first timers. Yeah.
So other than screaming and yelling at the Supreme Court, there's no accountability of the Supreme Court.
No, there is no immediate accountability, but the screaming and yelling is having an effect. And one audience that is particularly irritated is other judges. If you're a circuit court judge, you're very like a Supreme Court judge, particularly if you're in the DC circuit. You lead a similar life, you render similar decisions, and you have a very robust ethics code and enforcement and rules and all of that. And it's pretty common across all 11 circuits. So when they see these monkey shines up at the Supreme Court, not only do they find it obnoxious, they know that it is out of line. They know that it's out of line because they have to stay within the lines, and they know where those lines are, and they see the Supreme Court behaving outside those lines. So that pressure is really starting to build. And I've had two successes working that angle. When the Supreme Court ignored my questions about the personal hospitality hijinks, I wrote a letter to every single one of those 11 circuit court chief judges, and I said, hey, here's a hypothetical. Person who doesn't know the judge, invites them directly to stay at a resort, picks up the tab for them, has no relationship with them, has other guests around who have business before the court, and none of it gets disclosed because the invitation came directly from the owner of the resort to the judge. Is that legit in your circuit? So I went 0 for 11 in responses, which sent a pretty strong signal to me that somebody was telling him to don't do that. So we pursued it, and I got ready to have a hearing, and suddenly, pop, we got a response saying the judicial conference is going to take this up. And the second thing was on the phony amici curiae who come in like a dozen at a time, and they're all paid by the same people and making similar chorally sound arguments. I started bothering them about that, and they blew me off and paid no attention. So I sent letters to some of the circuit courts, and the next thing you know, there's a commission, a committee, a panel that's been established within the judicial conference to look at this, and judges on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals are saying, yeah, we actually need to know who is the power behind the throne when these phony baloney briefs come in. And so that is a weakness that they have to deal with. So yeah, the pressure matters. I don't know if the pressure matters to Thomas. I don't know if the pressure matters to Alito. I think there's every reason to believe that the pressure might matter to Barrett. I'll give her the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise. I'm confident the pressure matters to Roberts. I think he's beside himself right now. And I suspect that the pressure matters to Kavanaugh, who's got his own, problems of credibility. So to have the court's credibility problems added on his credibility problems doesn't help.
Not that this is going
Go
to
ahead.
change. I'm sorry.
Finish up.
Not that this is going to change, but what is your feeling about lifetime appointments on the Supreme Court?
It beats the hell out of getting them elected, I suppose. But I filed a bill to have them be termed. 18-year terms and then out. So I think that would help. And then it gets you on a regular schedule, so it's not serendipitous when people get these things. And the judges can't game it by going to their party just when it's time and saying, okay, I'll give you the vacancy. And if there's one thing that's a sign that you're doing something more than judging, it's when you're timing your departure to advantage a political party. The idea that that's okay is pretty abnormal. Yeah.
I think I need a civics lesson, so I'm not a lawyer or anything like that, but I don't remember who gets to appoint the Chief Justice. Is it a lifetime appointment or?
It's a lifetime appointment, and when the Chief Justice either retires or passes away, you get a new Chief Justice appointment. Sometimes you elevate an existing judge up to Chief Justice and then fill the gap. If I recall correctly, Roberts came straight to Chief Justice.
So you cannot reappoint this Chief Justice, another justice to be Chief Justice by the.
No, it's not an internal thing within the court. It's
Or the
actually,
president cannot do that on his own.
it's actually an office that the president appoints to, yeah. Yes?
What do you think of that, just the point that maybe we created this monster, dark money, that
Yeah.
the gradient trickled down, all of a sudden, we've got this mega wealth. And that, I mean, that's where it came from, isn't it? Don't we need progressive tax codes here to start
Yeah.
rolling this out,
Yeah.
rein in on this?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, there's some very, very big questions that this raises. One really, really big question is, why should a corporation have any role whatsoever in American politics? If you go back to the Constitution, there's no role. If you read the Federalist Papers, it's mentioned like twice, and they're talking about municipal corporations. And if you go back and follow the Philadelphia debates, zero notion that there was any role. When corporations exploded and took over politics, along came Teddy Roosevelt, cleaned up the whole mess. You had trust busters, you had muckrakers, you did all that stuff. We basically won the country back from the railroads and the miners and the, big crooked corporate powers. And then along comes the Powell decision, the memo, and the chamber starts working on this. And when Powell gets on the Supreme Court, he is not a big right winger. He voted for Roe v. Wade, as I recall. But what he did do is every time he had a decision about getting corporations into politics, he added power for corporations. The first one was Bellotti versus Bank of Massachusetts, when he said corporations could spend money in referenda, and then it expanded from there to actually even doing elections. And then he created a thing where, well, if you're a not-for-profit, that's a different thing. So not-for-profits can play, which obviously creates a screen through which corporations can play with the not-for-profit front group, which was exactly, by the way, it was forecast in his original memo, that corporations aren't going to want to be out there. They're going to want some intermediary who will catch the arrows for them. So the whole thing is pretty sketchy. It has been only Republican-appointed Supreme Court justices that have created this role for corporations in American politics. And, I mean, if you're a CEO, and there are people here who are pretty powerful folks, you have a lot of advantages already. You got a really good mailing list. You got all your employees. You got all your customers. You got all your suppliers. You're totally free to tell them, hey, vote for this guy, he's good for our company. You've got a pretty big checkbook usually, you can write fairly big checks. You know, you kind of are a step ahead of most people in terms of getting yourself heard in the political contest. The idea that in addition to that, you also need to have this like transformer machine of your corporation that can step up beside you, you can drive it around, that can spend millions and billions of dollars in politics at your direction and hide that it's doing that. What could possibly go wrong? We're seeing what could possibly go wrong. We've got to fight back hard, I think.
Progressive tax code, are you still for more progressive tax?
Yeah.
Free radio.
Absolutely. A lot of time on the finance committee trying to do exactly that. Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, let me thank everybody for coming out, and I hope that you enjoy reading the book. I'm gonna go out there and sign some if you're interested. I do think we're at a real turning point in our country, and I wrote this book with the idea that it would be not just, I'm not allowed to get money out of books, so it's not like I make any money. This is a lot of weekends and nights and long airplane flights and stuff writing it, but it is a missile. And it's a missile that's intended to hit the court and to make people understand that this needs to be fixed. Because all the black robes and all the high benches and all the oh yes, oh yes, oh yes in the world can't make a court if it's not serving justice any longer. If it is serving outside special interests, and there is immense pattern evidence. Again, Dan was a pretty spectacular lawyer, and if you had to take the Supreme Court's pattern of decisions into a courtroom to prove bias and discrimination, the other side would be settling that case. A plaintiff's lawyer dreams of 72-0. It just doesn't happen in real life. But that's what the court is, actually over 80 now, and it's getting worse. I'll make one last point, just because I said early on, this is not a conservative court, it's a captured court. There actually are quite legitimate conservative legal doctrines. We can argue about them. I think originalism is a big bundle of horseshit, frankly. But other people are entitled to a different view, and we can have a, on the record, legit argument about it. Modesty, making small decisions instead of big decisions. Respect for precedent, not changing the law once people are relying on it. There are all sorts of conservative judicial doctrines that are out there. And what one of the really big tells is in all of this is that some of the very biggest decisions that they have made for their donors have crushed through those doctrines, completely violated them. If you want to find originalism in Citizens United, you got to go to Justice Stevens' dissent. If you want to find respect for precedent in Dobbs, you ain't gonna find it. This is a court that is violating conservative principles all the time as it seeks to get to the results that the people who help put them on the court want. And it's part of an effort to restructure American society in ways that they tried at the ballot box. And this is stuff they couldn't even get Republicans to vote for. So they gave up and they moved on the court, and now this unaccountable court is doing things that even Republicans wouldn't do because they have to answer to the public at the next election, and the court doesn't. So on that happy note,